Welcome. My name is Ross Emmett, and I'm the director of ASU's Center for the Study of Economic Liberty, which is the sponsor for today's event, as part of the Center's Perspective on Economic Liberty series. It's graciously funded by a grant to the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, of which the Center is a part, from the Bradley Foundation. Today's lecture will focus on environmental issues from a private property and market-based perspective. We will ask whether private property rights could allow voluntary non-use of privately held land and other environmental resources. And if so, whether such rights would help alleviate the devastating effects of wildfire damage across the American West, thereby also providing greater protection to wildlife habitat as well. Our speaker this evening is Sean Regan, Vice President of Research at the Property and Environment Research Center, which is most often simply identified by its acronym, PERC. It's located in Bozeman, Montana, a center devoted to environmental policy solutions which build upon private property rights and markets. His research and writing has been published in journals such as Science, Natural Resource Journal, and the Utah Law Review, and he frequently writes for popular outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, Outside, Los Angeles Times, High Country News, the National Review, and Reason. Sean has testified before both houses of Congress, has appeared on national radio programs such as NPR's On Point and American Public Media's Marketplace Morning Report. He holds a Master of Science in Applied Economics from Montana State University and degrees in Economics and Environmental Science from Berry College. He went from Georgia to Montana, right? He's also a former backcountry ranger for the National Park Service. After Sean's talk, he'll be joined by Professor Brian Leonard from the School of Sustainability, who is a senior fellow at the Center PERC, for a brief dialogue about key points from Sean's talk before a more general Q&A. So there will be time for Q&A, but Sean's going to talk, then they're going to talk together, then we get to ask questions. For students, I might also throw a plug in here for PERC's Summer Boot Camp, held in Bozeman, which provides the chance to think more about property rights and economic solutions to environmental issues while experiencing the American West up close. Not that you don't here as well, just in a different part of the West. As for others, PERC's Lone Mountains fellowships are available for faculty and graduate students who are interested in advancing projects related to the role of markets, public policy, property rights, and governance in affecting environmental resources.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Great. Well, thank you, Ross, for that introduction, and thanks to the Center for the invitation to come here. I'm really honored to be with you, and I was telling Ross earlier, coming from Montana, where it was -10 last week, I'm very appreciative to be here in warm weather, relatively speaking, warm weather. Feels warm to me, so thanks for that. As Ross mentioned, I'm with PERC, and so we are a conservation organization, research-based organization based in Bozeman, Montana, that's dedicated to advancing conservation through markets, incentives, trade, voluntary partnerships, and we do research, we do applied programs, on the ground working with conservation organizations to implement some of these ideas, and we do some policy work as well. And so in my role at PERC, I help kind of oversee a lot of the research efforts that we do, and some of that work ranges from on a variety of different topics. Lately, we've been doing work on endangered species recovery. We do work on National Park Service, deferred maintenance. I used to work for the National Park Service, so that's an issue near and dear to my heart. And then public land management too. And so the topic today on wildfires and forests is mostly an issue dealing with national forests and public land management. And PERC was founded in 1980 in Bozeman, Montana. And so we're a 40-plus-year-old organization and proudly based in Bozeman. And that's where I'll sort of start the discussion today. We'll be showing lots of pictures to make this hopefully interesting. So this is Bozeman. This topic is kind of near and dear to my heart because we live with this fire risk all the time. And this is a picture that was taken from my neighborhood a few years ago when smoke started to sort of billow up from the forest nearby, and residents started to take notice of these little bit of smoke that was coming out. That's our M for Montana State. There's an A here, right? Exactly. So we have an M, and so this is a really popular spot. Exactly. And so smoke started to come up near the M, and everybody started to get concerned. And at first, it looked like it was under control, and then the next day, the winds came in, and it blew up. And so this obviously caused a lot of concern. After a week of this fire burning, it burned over 8,000 acres. It destroyed 30 homes, and it injured several firefighters in the process. And so this was a big event in Bozeman. There hadn't been fire in this forest in a long, long time, and it was dense and overgrown. And so it got a lot of people concerned, not just because of their safety for this particular fire, but because of a related issue that Bozeman's been dealing with for a long time, which is protecting our water supply. And so nearby on the southern end of town is another forest that is the watershed for the city. And so this forest has been the focus of a restoration project that's been in the works for, at the time, 15 years since it was initially proposed, that had been stalled through a variety of different obstacles related to just sort of procedural delays, working with the Forest Service as a partnership between the city of Bozeman and the National Forest Service to implement a restoration project to remove some of the dense trees, to protect the watershed from the risks of an extreme fire that would cause ash and sediment to infiltrate the stream. And the concern with the city is that this could knock off our water supply. Our water treatment facility wouldn't be able to withstand the impacts of this fire. And so the Bozeman Municipal Watershed Project had been proposed 15 years ago, and it had been stalled for that amount of time in litigation and different procedural delays. So the fire north of town got a lot of people concerned about, well, what if this happens to our watershed? And we're trying to get something done to deal with this issue, but it's been delayed. So that's, and so here's another picture of the watershed. And the concern, so another fire that had happened a few years before happened in a nearby town called Lincoln, Montana. And this was a fire that burned a forest restoration project that had been proposed. It had been stalled by litigation and different bureaucratic delays for 7 years. And in the middle of that process, burned up in a large wildfire. And the project was actually delayed by litigation that was intended to protect wildlife habitat for elk and other species. And while it was tied up in litigation, the project area burned and destroyed the habitat that the litigation was seeking to protect. So this got a lot of people concerned in Bozeman because that's what we wanted to avoid. That's what we want to avoid in the case of the Bozeman Municipal Watershed Project. So just to kind of preview where I'm headed with the talk today, I'm going to talk about a lot of the work that PERC has been doing over the last several years on this topic of wildfires and forest health. And I'm going to talk about how forests have changed dramatically over the past century. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures to sort of illustrate this point. And they've changed in ways that make them more prone to extreme fires. And fires today are becoming more dangerous, destructive, and costly, in large part because of the ways that our forests have changed over time. The good news is there's growing consensus, though, on what to do, and that is to restore those historic forest conditions and how to do it, and that's through proactive forest management. But a variety of different barriers, whether they're policy, legal, or practical kind of economic barriers that we'll talk about, often stand in the way. And overcoming those barriers will require ultimately embracing partnerships and different creative financing solutions, as well as several different policy reforms that we can talk about. So I think the best way when I talk about this is often to just sort of show pictures that I think illustrate just how dramatically our forests have changed. And so this first picture here is a photo taken in 1896. This is in Colorado, outside of Denver. And this is something that forest ecologists will often do with repeat photography, is find some of the oldest photographs that they could find and then try to recreate those images over time and see how forests have changed. And so in the first picture here, you can see that it's sort of an open scattered landscape. These are ponderosa pines, which are adapted to fire. And they're open woodlands in part because they were exposed to frequent low-intensity fires that kept other vegetation from outcompeting the ponderosa pines and promoted this kind of open canopy forest that was really common in the late 1800s throughout much of the West. So when that photo was recreated in 2000, you can see that a dense forest had built up, which ultimately fueled a large extreme fire that burned in 2002. And after that fire burned through, you can see that the forest is basically gone. The fire burned so hot that the forest has never recovered, and it's basically dominated now by shrublands. And this is a story that is happening increasingly across much of the West. Extreme fires burn so hot that the forests themselves the future of the forests themselves are in jeopardy. Another way to showcase this, so this is Yosemite Valley. A lot of you might recognize some of these landscapes. This is El Capitan. And so this is a photo taken by Carlton Watkins in the mid-1800s. And when that photo was retaken in 1944, you can see that there's a lot of trees that are getting in the way. There was a restoration project that removed some of that vegetation in 1944, so it opened back up that scenic view that Carlton Watkins was sort of drawn to this place in the first place. But in 2009, that photo was just completely obscured, or that view, rather, was completely obscured by trees. And this story is, you can see this in many of the photos that have been taken, repeat photographs that have been taken in Yosemite Valley that I think really illustrate just how dramatically our forests have changed over time. So John Muir in the late 1800s wrote a lot about California's forests and the Sierra Nevadas, and you read his writings and you hear him talk about how open the landscape was. He describes being able to ride a horse through the forest, and not have to worry about getting tangled up in vegetation. So he wrote in 1894 that the inviting openness of the Sierra woods is one of their most distinguishing characteristics. Frederick Law Olmsted in the mid-1800s also wrote at length about the wide open meadows, the most tranquil meadows with miles and miles of scenery in Yosemite Valley. And you can see these sort of side-by-side pictures that illustrate just how dramatically those forests have changed over time. Now, why have they changed? So an ecologist I think has a really great quote on this to illustrate the humans played a big role in this, right? So Native Americans, these weren't untouched lands. At the time, the early white settlers or early white visitors to the region often thought that where they were just seeing, this is what nature is, right? But M. Cat Anderson writes that much of the landscape in California that so impressed early writers, photographers, and landscape painters was in fact a cultural landscape, not the wilderness that they imagined. Native Americans regularly set fire to the valley to clear the forests, to promote open meadows, and to grow food at times. Today, the National Park Service estimates that 2/3 of Yosemite Valley's meadows have been lost to encroaching forests. This is also seen in the giant sequoia groves in Yosemite Valley as well. So this is a picture taken in 1890 compared to a photo taken in 1960. And sequoias are well adapted to fire. They actually need fire to regenerate. The cones open up and the seeds can disperse, and other species will, in the absence of fire, other species will outcompete sequoias, and the seedlings are unable to regenerate. And so you might have heard in the last couple of years there's been several large fires in different sequoia groves in California, in part because of the dense vegetation that has grown up around sequoias that serve as sort of these ladders that enable the fire to get from the ground to the canopy where it can spread and it can ultimately kill the sequoia trees. And so thousands of sequoia trees were killed just a few years ago in some of the large fires in California. So what's causing this? We talked about sort of how humans played a big role in sort of in maintaining these open forests in Yosemite Valley and other places. But what's driving this this image that's becoming increasingly common, that you see in the news all the time in the summer, right? And what we're increasingly seeing in Montana, and I'm sure you experience this in Arizona too, with more and more extreme wildfires. Well, one of the reasons is fire suppression. Essentially, we had more than a century of really extreme fire suppression. This is a photo from what's called the Big Burn of 1910, which was a large fire in Idaho, the Idaho region, that really sort of started this new era of policy towards putting out all fires, suppressing all fires. And so the Forest Service for a long time has had a policy, actually, is it called the 10 a.m. policy. And the policy says that all fires have to be out by 10 a.m. the next day. And so there's very aggressive fire suppression that it was effective at the end of the day, in large part at preventing a lot of large fires, but at the same time causing this really dense buildup of vegetation, overgrown forests that today now are susceptible to very extreme fires. In addition, there was a sea change sort of in the approach that we think about, from the time of the early settlers thinking that they were sort of seeing this wilderness that we had to kind of leave alone, right, and not touch. That sort of perspective, carries through a lot of the sort of policies that over the last century have affected national forest management, and a lot of that has been largely hands off. So leave nature alone, and that will be the sort of wilderness characteristics that we want to promote. While well-intentioned, there's this unintended consequence, I think, which is that this is often the scene, at least in my part of the country, right, where you drive around these national forests and you see dense forests, often with dead or dying trees, which is these sort of dense fuel loads promote disease and insect infestations that can make these forests even more at risk of extreme fires. So there was a study a few years ago that the Forest Service did on sort of what is driving today's mega fires, and they looked at all these different factors, and they were able to assign different percentages to what's sort of ultimately driving these large fires. And so climate change plays a role, so that's certainly a factor. They attributed 14% of that. There's fire weather, so conditions that really promote the spread of fire, so high winds, low relative humidity. Topography can play a role, but ultimately fuel loads, like the amount of fuel vegetation in the forest that we have today, was the driving factor in this study in terms of what's ultimately driving a large portion of these fires. So wildfires today are bigger. Their average size is twice what it was in the 1990s. They're more destructive. Wildfires consume twice as much land each year on average than they did in the 1990s. So the headlines are true. It is becoming more of a problem. They're more costly. So suppression costs are now around $2.5 billion, and that's roughly a doubling or more of the level that they were in the 1990s. And they're mostly on federal lands. So I think this is an important point. Fires on federal lands are, on average, 5 times larger than non-federal lands. And they're increasingly burning up a larger and larger portion of the Forest Service's budget. So wildfire spending now accounts for well over half of the agency's spending. And you can see that that's a pretty dramatic change in just the last decade or so. And that's caused a lot of people who work in this area to say that the Forest Service has really become the fire service. It's not really in the business these days as much of managing forests as it is in fighting fires. And that's definitely reflected in terms of the share of its appropriations that are spent on things like wildfire. And we'll talk in a little bit about how that might be changing. So certainly there are big impacts to communities. I talked about Bozeman and some of the concerns we have with our watershed. That's not a story that's unique to us, but that's just what I know and live. But wildfire destruction, a recent study found that it has more than doubled in just the past decade in terms of the number of structures that are destroyed each year. Watersheds, which we talked about, increased erosion can worsen water quality and affect drinking water. Habitat. So there was an interesting piece in the Los Angeles Times a few months ago about California spotted owls and how some of the efforts in the state to protect lands for owls had this it backfired in a sense where, because of this sort of hands-off management, promoted ultimately forests that were more at risk of extreme fire and fires that would ultimately destroy the owl's habitat. So there's sort of this acknowledgement now in some of the state agencies about maybe we should figure out ways to manage these forests a little more actively so that we can avoid this outcome where the habitat just gets destroyed. So health effects, this is something that I think is becoming more widely appreciated in recent years in terms of some of the research that's being done on the effects of wildfire smoke. But smoke from wildfire has significantly worsened over the past decade, reversing decades of improvements in air quality made under the Clean Air Act. A recent study found that there's been a 27-fold increase in the number of people that are subjected to unhealthy levels of wildfire smoke in the West. And then emissions. So wildfires are a large source of emissions of carbon dioxide and other pollutants. There's a recent study that came out just a few months ago. In 2020, which was a really bad fire year in the West, especially in California, California wildfires released more carbon dioxide than all industrial facilities statewide. And that year, fires in California emitted enough carbon pollution to erase 16 years worth of the state's greenhouse gas emission reductions. So essentially all the progress that the state had done in the previous decade or so to reduce carbon dioxide emissions were kind of offset by just one single fire season. And so again, when you have these fires that can destroy essentially the forest and inhibit its ability to reproduce, this can be a major source of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So the good news, shifting gears. That was kind of doom and gloom, but there is good news. So there is a growing recognition of what to do here. And I think, a lot of PERC's work in the last couple of years has been focused on proactive forest management to reduce these extreme fire risks. So forest restoration reduces fire risks by restoring those historic forest conditions, so the kinds of conditions that those early photographs showed, where you have, in much of the West, you have more open canopied forests where the sunlight can reach the surface to promote, more of these kind of meadows and open grasslands. To restore those historic conditions in ways that promote healthy and resilient landscapes that are ultimately more resilient to wildfire. So fires are going to happen, but what can we do to limit their impacts so that they're not as extreme and destructive as the ones we have today? So forest restoration involves removing excess fuels, which prevents fires from reaching the canopy, and instead keeps fires on the ground where they're less destructive and easier to fight. So what do we mean by forest restoration? So there's two primary strategies for forest restoration. One is mechanical treatment. So this is kind of selective thinning of smaller diameter trees that have grown up and are often crowding out the larger trees. So you can think of like the ponderosa pines and the sequoias that I mentioned that are getting outcompeted by white firs and Douglas firs and other species that are prone to fire that can spread up into the canopy and destroy the forest. So selectively removing some of those smaller diameter trees, in addition to prescribed burns, which is restoring some of that low intensity fire that our western forests were historically well adapted to, but have been largely removed from the landscape due to fire suppression over the last century. So this is what forest restoration looks like in action. So I'll show you a few photos here. But you can see in this top photo that you have all these trees that are growing up that are going to outcompete these larger ponderosa pines. And through a combination of selective thinning and prescribed burning, you can promote this open forest landscape that's much like the original photos that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. Prescribed burning is a really effective tool. So this is deliberately setting fires under really controlled conditions, under ideal weather conditions, that can remove this vegetation, this dense brush that's building up in the forest, and promote these native grasslands that you see in the bottom photo here. And this is actually a picture taken in Arizona of a restoration project that shows a before and after of what this can look like. And so you can see on the left just a very dense forest that when we go in and do some of this management, we can open up that canopy and significantly reduce the fire risk on the landscape and restoring, much like the original photos that I showed at the beginning. It's this open, scattered trees, open landscape. So something I want to stress is that this is like the growing recognition of this problem is a bipartisan recognition of the need for forest restoration. And this has really changed just in the last 5 years or so. So this is, last year, the Biden administration's Forest Service unveiled this 10-year wildfire strategy, which they describe as kind of a sea change, a paradigm shift in terms of how we think about forest management. And so the goal of this strategy is to significantly ramp up forest restoration across all national forests. So 20 million acres, treating up to an additional 20 million acres of National Forest System lands, 30 million acres of state and private and tribal lands. So a total of, the goal is over to the next decade, 50 million acres of forest restoration to really try to address this challenge of hands-off management and fire suppression, to move more towards proactively trying to restore those forest conditions to make them more resilient to fire. And so this is a big deal. And so the Biden administration is calling for a lot of money to be spent on this over the next 10 years and to really get the Forest Service back in the business of managing forests instead of keeping kind of hands-off and just fighting fires, as we've seen in the last several years. And it's because it works. So there's a couple pictures here. So this is a photo from the bootleg fire in Oregon in 2021, which is a very large fire. And so there's been some great accounts of just the effectiveness of forest treatments, of fuels treatments projects, forest restoration projects, at reducing these extreme fire risks. So the bootleg fire was a massive fire, and when it got to areas where forest restoration had been done, firefighters were able to get the fire under control, keep the blaze on the ground, keep it from reaching up into the canopies and spreading through the canopies and destroying the forest, but could actually fight the fire and make a lot of progress on that. So the story in the bootleg fire is that the Nature Conservancy has a reserve in Oregon called the Sican Marsh, and they had over several years had done a lot of forest management on that. And when the fire reached the Sican Marsh, it was able to be ultimately brought under control there. And so this is a picture of some of that work that they had done on the Sican Marsh that shows the aftermath of the bootleg fire. So you can tell here that the areas with no treatment are sort of scorched earth. Areas with thinning only were impacted, but ultimately, there's a lot of trees that are still alive and are going to recover. But the areas with a combination of both thinning and prescribed fire, you can just see dramatic evidence of the effectiveness of these strategies at reducing fire risks. Likewise, the Caldor fire, which also burned in 2021 in the Lake Tahoe area of California, was a very large fire as well. But when it got to areas near South Lake Tahoe, where a variety of different fuels treatments projects had been implemented over several years, it was ultimately able to get under control, and firefighters were able to keep the fires on the ground and to ultimately save the city from burning. So this is a picture of the Caldor fire and some of the impacts that it did certainly burn up a lot of nearby smaller communities, but the work that they had done near South Lake Tahoe really paid off. And then lastly, this is a picture of the Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, which has done a lot of work with prescribed burning specifically. And so the top photo is a kind of before photo. The middle photo is, you can see, after a prescribed burn. So that's not a wildfire, that's after the prescribed burn. And then a fire burned through in 2015 in between the middle and the last photo, but you can tell that a lot of the vegetation, the trees are still standing. There's not a whole lot of obvious impacts from the fire. And so this is a picture that's often used to showcase the benefits of these prescribed fire strategies. One other benefit that I thought I'd mention in Arizona is water supply benefits. And so there was a recent study about the benefits to water supply from these thinning projects. And so thinning forests, a recent study found that thinning forests could increase water supply in reservoirs on the Salt and Verde rivers by 10%, support for restoration projects in northern Arizona. So this is one of the reasons why there's been a lot of, and I'll talk in a little bit about some of the partnerships that have been forged to try to spur more of this type of work for some of the water supply benefits that they provide. But the increased value of the surface water storage by over $100 million as a result of some of these forest thinning projects. So shifting gears to some of the obstacles. So why aren't we doing more of this if it works so well? Well, there are a lot of policy barriers to this. And so one of the statistics that we often point to, so the Forest Service estimates that there are 80 million acres of Forest Service land that are in need of forest restoration. And from the wildfire strategy that I showed you, so the agency has this goal to treat 20 million acres over the next 10 years. There's still a significant backlog. And so we've got a lot of work to do. It's great that we're focusing on it. The Forest Service is focusing on this 20 million acres over the next 10 years, but you can see that this is a big challenge. So what can we do to overcome some of the obstacles that prevent us from doing more of this type of work? So there are several policy obstacles that get in the way of doing more of this type of work. So permitting barriers is one of them. I mentioned at the beginning that the Bozeman project has been stalled for 15 years. A large part of that has been just getting through the permitting process to do forest restoration. The National Environmental Policy Act is a law that requires environmental analysis for forest restoration projects and other federal agency actions. And it's often a barrier to doing these sorts of projects because delay matters, right? So a 5 or 10 year delay on a project could mean the difference between the forest burning up or us being able to manage the forest in a way that can prevent fires from occurring. So people have started to really focus on, and PERC's done some work on the effect of environmental review and how can we sort of streamline some of that effort of those processes to be able to do more of this type of work in a timely manner. So procedural delays, this is a related issue, but the Endangered Species Act is a well-intentioned law that is designed to protect species, but often it's the way that it's executed can backfire in terms of, I talked about the spotted owl example. The Forest Service, whenever a fuels treatment project might affect an endangered or threatened species, the Forest Service has to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service on the impacts to the species. That sounds like a sort of simple thing to do, but often that can take years and years to do. And that was one of the issues in the Bozeman project that caused, contributed to the decade-plus long delays was impacts to Canada lynx populations in the Bozeman area. And so these consultation requirements, while well-intentioned, can cause just significant delays. Environmental regulations also play a role. So wildfires are exempt from Clean Air Act rules for maybe obvious reasons, because we can't control them, but not prescribed fires. So when the agency needs to or wants to conduct prescribed fires, it has to get through Clean Air Act regulations, which can often contribute to more of these sorts of delays and costs of doing this type of work. And litigation is another factor. So the Forest Service faces more lawsuits under NEPA than any other federal agency, and often it's for forest restoration projects. So some of the efforts to protect species, though, can, like I said, can backfire if ultimately what that causes is years and years of protracted litigation that delays the project from getting off the ground. So how long does it take? So PERC did a study a few years ago that looked at this in the context of the National Environmental Policy Act and looked at different categories of NEPA analysis to see just how long does it take to get through the process. So once you start the paperwork for a NEPA analysis, for doing an environmental analysis or an environmental impact statement, from the time that you start that process to the time that you're actually implementing the project can take years. And so this breaks it down in couple of different categories. Categorical exclusions are the simplest projects. Those are the ones that are often the smallest. And so they don't take as long, but you still can see there's 3 years or more than 3 years on average for forest projects to get through just the categorical exclusion process. But for the large projects, which are ultimately what's needed, those are the ones that require, on the far right, the environmental impact statements. Projects can take 5 to 7 years. And if they're litigated, they take even longer. So you would add around 2 years to that list, to that chart, if the project is litigated. And litigation is something that we deal with a lot in our region just because of how many endangered species are in the region of Montana that are often the focus of some of the environmental litigation, just the questions around impacts to species of forest restoration projects. And so this is a big factor in raising the cost and certainly increasing the risks of extreme fires. There are also economic challenges. So funding these projects is a major challenge. One estimate is that it costs roughly $1,000 an acre to do forest restoration. And at that cost, much more funding than what the Biden administration's wildfire strategy has put forth will be required to ultimately address the backlog of restoration projects in our national forests. And then there are other economic challenges stemming from markets. So are there markets for the materials from restoration projects, and are there mills to process them? This is a major challenge in much of the West, and especially in this region too, so these projects often aren't traditional commercial timber projects. These are smaller diameter trees, or they're vegetation that's doesn't have commercial value. And there's been, over time, a decline in the mill infrastructure in a lot of these Western communities that can process some of this material. And so a major challenge has been just to try to, we have products that are coming out of these forest restoration projects, but are there actually mills to send them to that we can create wood products out of? And so this is an economic challenge that we have to face as well. So getting to the solutions, two that I want to highlight are to embrace partnerships and to cut red tape to ramp up forest restoration. And so I want to talk here, just to kind of wrap up, about a few of really innovative partnerships, and several of them that are happening in this region that I think demonstrate the path forward on how to significantly increase the amount of forest restoration that we're doing. So the Northern Arizona Fund is a collaboration between the National Forest Foundation and the Salt River Project that funds restoration projects in 5 national forests in northern Arizona. Basically what they do is they raise money from a diverse group of supporters, including Arizona's Department of Fish and Wildlife, the city of Phoenix, the city of Scottsdale, Coca-Cola, there's other businesses, conservation organizations, and more. to fund these restoration projects. And so why are they doing this? Well, I mean, so the perspective here is that we should pay for these forest restoration projects today because it's better than suffering the consequences of wildfire tomorrow. So, I mean, as we all know, we benefit from healthy forests, and for the reasons we've talked about, whether it's clean water, recreational opportunities, healthy wildlife populations. And the recognition of that value has fueled interest in bringing these diverse partners to the table to actually contribute dollars to getting these projects off the ground. And so over the last decade or more, they've raised tens of millions of dollars to help fund some of these restoration projects in Arizona. Forest resilience bonds is another really interesting idea. So we work a little bit with Blue Forest Conservation, which is a nonprofit group based in California that has developed this really innovative financing idea to get more forest restoration done and to get it done faster. So forest resilience bonds raise private capital to pay for forest restoration projects upfront, raise the money to pay it upfront, and allow beneficiaries to pay those investors back over time as the benefits are achieved. And so the first project that Blue Forest was able to get done was a forest restoration project in Tahoe National Forest across 7,000 acres. They raised $4 million from investors with an interest in preserving healthy forests, or like impact investors with an interest in environmental outcomes. So the state of California and a water agency in California have agreed to repay the bond over time as the benefits are achieved from the forest restoration project. And the Blue Forest estimates that this sort of financing approach dramatically sped up the ability of the Forest Service to get this project done much faster than they would have been able to do without this sort of financing. So the estimate was that the project was able to get done in 4 years as opposed to 10 or 12 years that it would have taken without the forest resilience bond. And so this was really successful. Blue Forest is now trying to replicate this model across in other national forests in California and then throughout much of the West as well to speed up forest restoration work and to recognize that the benefits that the private sector can contribute to these projects as they have an interest in funding them and seeing them happen. So the Forest Restoration Initiative is another Arizona-based project, often called FORFRI, and it's a partnership between tribes, businesses, and conservation groups in northern Arizona. The goal is to reduce these fire risks through long-term stewardship contracts. And so the idea here is that the Forest Service can enter into these 10-year or even in some cases 20-year stewardship contracts to do large-scale forest restoration projects. They treated 700,000 acres in just by 2021, so that's been ongoing for the last decade or so. And the funding relies on finding profitable uses for these small diameter trees and securing its reliable supply. And so these long-term stewardship contracts are designed to enable the Forest Service to assure that there is going to be a steady stream of a supply of this material. And the idea is that that can motivate investment in the mill infrastructure that's needed to process some of that material. So there's been some new innovative wood products kind of processing of material from FORFRI specifically that's designed to make use of these small diameter trees. And if we can kind of secure that supply and ensure that that industry, if they make those investments in that mill infrastructure, that the supply will be there to provide it over time. So that's the idea behind FORFRI. And the last one I'll mention is Good Neighbor Authority. And so this is a tool that the Forest Service that enables the states really to take the lead on planning, implementing, and carrying out forest restoration projects on federal lands. Importantly, states under Good Neighbor Authority agreements get to keep the revenue from timber contracts so that they can fund additional restoration projects in the future. And there are several projects that are ongoing now in Arizona, in Montana, and in much of the West. And this is a tool that we've been working on a lot at PERC over the years in terms of helping the Forest Service do more of these sorts of things and to expand its eligibility to include tribes and counties as well as states. So I'll conclude with a few of the policy opportunities that we see at PERC before we can open it up for some questions. So the first is to streamline environmental reviews. So we talked about how long it can take to get through the process, the NEPA process for doing restoration projects. Specifically, the one way to get around this is to expand categorical exclusions. So this is how we this is the easiest path forward through the NEPA process to getting projects done. And there are a lot of restrictions on what exactly is eligible for a categorical exclusion under NEPA. And so some of the ongoing conversations, there's several bills before Congress right now that are looking at different aspects of this in a bipartisan way to apply more of these sort of categorical exclusions. So there's still some time that it takes to get through that process, obviously, but it's a much more streamlined process to ramp up our ability to do forest restoration in a more timely manner. Cut unnecessary red tape. So avoid what one Forest Service official has called analysis paralysis by limiting these ESA consultations to projects with on-the-ground impacts. In the case of the Bozeman project that I mentioned that was caught up in these consultation delays, at the end of the day, the litigation and the procedural delays that lasted 15 years didn't change the project. It's a procedural thing that just causes the agency to have to go back to the drawing board and have more consultation with other agencies, but it doesn't fundamentally change the outcome often. And so, one of the ideas that we put forth is to really narrow in on what exactly are we trying to do with consultation and avoid this unnecessary analysis paralysis for projects that aren't ultimately going to change at the end of the day. And then make litigation less disruptive, require lawsuits to be filed quickly. This is the process. I think now you can file a lawsuit 6 years or so after a decision has been made to reduce that time period to encourage folks that object to these projects to just be able to file their objections quicker so we can get through the litigation and not unnecessarily delay much needed restoration projects. Scale up partnerships. So empower the Forest Service to enter into longer term contracts and agreements. The agency, as I mentioned, can form these stewardship contracts, but they cannot commit funds for more than a few years in advance. So the agency can't commit beyond what it has in appropriations. And so this creates a challenge for ensuring that steady supply of material from these forest restoration projects that's needed to promote more of the mill infrastructure that we need to accommodate and to process some of this material. So without that reliable supply, we don't have these kind of innovations that we need in the wood products industry to make forest restoration work more profitable. And ultimately to embrace markets, so to promote innovative markets for wood products. The idea that we put forward here is to endow the Forest Service with a flexible restoration fund to engage in cost share agreements with different partners. So this would enable the Forest Service to commit those funds over a longer period of time rather than being limited by their appropriations requirements, which really hamstring their ability to engage in these sorts of partnerships. So to conclude on an optimistic note, the project that I mentioned at the beginning in Bozeman did ultimately get underway last year. The guy you see here on the right is the local district ranger. He had told us that the markings that they had put on the trees 15 years ago when the project started had begun to fade of the trees they were going to cut. So they had to go back and remark all those trees because so much time had passed between when the project had started and when it was proposed and when they were ultimately able to start the work that they had to go back and mark the trees again. But the project has now, I'm happy to report, has gotten underway. Last year they were doing some of the initial thinning and kind of selective thinning work to reduce fire risk and to remove a lot of that dense vegetation. And so we're breathing a little bit easier in Bozeman, and we hope we don't have the large fire come through that I showed at the beginning that affected the area north of town. So for now, that work is underway, and hopefully more of this work will be happening in the years to come as as there's just growing recognition of the need for this type of work and bipartisan agreement on what to do to get there. And so I have a few publications that I kind of referenced through this that describe some of PERC's work, the analysis on environmental review. Some of those are out front. We put out a policy report a few years ago called Fix America's Forests that has a lot of other ideas, more than what I've mentioned up here, in terms of how we can do more of this work in our national forests. And then we also put out a magazine twice a year, and so I brought several of those too, and we did a whole issue last summer on how to confront the wildfire crisis. And so a lot of the things that we've talked about today are in that issue as well. So you're welcome to take those, and I'll conclude with that. Great.
Thanks, Sean. We're going to ask Sean to come over and sit in the chair, and he's going to be joined by Brian Leonard, professor here at ASU, for a short discussion, and then we will open for general public questions. So you can be thinking about your questions while the two of them are seeding your minds.
You'll cut me off when you're ready to go to general Q&A?
Try.
Okay. All right, thanks Ross, and thanks Sean. So Sean, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role that markets could potentially play. I was really interested in this Blue Forest Conservation Group, and maybe you could tell us sort of who benefits from thinning, and what are the ways in which we could maybe sort of leverage that into some sort of funding partnerships. Are there ways that markets can help us do that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important challenge right now. Is, as I mentioned, I mean, sometimes these involve a commercial element of thinning. Like there are trees that can be sold under traditional kind of commercial timber contracts, but often it's these small diameter trees. So picture very small but densely packed vegetation that needs to be removed from the forest to prevent those fires from going up the ladder to the canopy.
What do you mean by small diameter?
Like that big. So Douglas firs that are encroaching upon a ponderosa pine and ultimately kind of choking out that species and preventing it from regenerating. And that's certainly the case with the sequoias that I mentioned. And so these are really small diameter trees. And so this has been a challenge for a long time. PERC actually, we have a partnership with this is a very small scale project, but it gets at the challenge here, with an entrepreneur who would go in and harvest some of those really small Douglas firs in western Montana in an effort to save these ponderosa pine forests. And then he would craft these high-end pins and clocks and things that would showcase all the rings, and you could get these custom-made pins. And if you're interested, you can talk to me afterwards. But it's a neat thing. You could find on the tree your birthday or your anniversary, and they would mark it, and it's a very nice product. But the idea behind it too was that it was also restoring these forests by removing these trees from the ponderosa pine forest. And so the point is that these are the challenge is a little bit different. It's not as simple as just saying we need more logging. I mean, maybe we do need more logging, but we really also need more targeted, selective, removals of these dense fuels. And at the end of the day, to make this, to be able to finance this work and get it off the ground, the more we can do to find profitable uses of those resources, the easier it will be to do this work moving forward. And so that's where you see these partnerships emerge, because and you have the importance of markets is to be able to harness the value that's coming from the forest, and maybe that's in creating wood products that can be used in construction. Maybe it's using sort of like making particle board. Maybe there's been innovations in biochar. It's kind of like a fertilizer-like material that can be, picture even just the brush and the vegetation that doesn't really have wood value as a wood product, but can we come? Are there innovative markets for these materials that so we're not just having to burn this stuff in piles, but we're finding ways to use it ultimately. And so there was interest in biochar in light of fertilizer costs were going really high after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all the fallout from that. And so there was this interest in can we find more of this use of biochar from these restoration projects? So the point is just how can we find more uses for those markets to help fuel more of this, encourage more of this kind of work? And then so how does the Forest Service then also provide more assurances to these entrepreneurs that and mills that want to perhaps take this material to make the investments that are needed to modify the mills to make use of these smaller diameter trees. So those are some of the challenges around markets and how it interacts with policy.
Okay, great, thanks. So I was really struck, you're talking about some of these lawsuits that are kind of habitat focused. And I was struck by how self-defeating those seem to be, right? Like, we can't cut down trees, we got to protect the spotted owl habitat, and then the whole forest burns down. So, what gives? Are there knowledge gaps or research needs? Like, as an academic, are there papers that we need to go write, studies that we need to go do? Like, how could academic research kind of help move the ball forward? It just seems odd that there's these groups out there engaging in this behavior.
Yeah.
So is there a research need, or what's?
I mean, I think there is a research need. One of the challenges, maybe it's a mystery or a research question, is there's a lot of variation across the country in terms of where this litigation is happening. So it happens to be the case that Region 1 of the Forest Service, which encompasses my home state of Montana, is the most litigated region. Now there's other regions that just aren't as litigated. I mean, some of that we think might have to do with just, you have to have the ability to bring a lawsuit, so you have to have grounds to sue and a reason to object to a project. And often that involves endangered species. And it just so happens in our region that a lot of the national forest land also overlaps with designated critical habitat for different species. And so that's often one of the vehicles for objecting to projects. Now, like you pointed out, though, I mean, it can be self-defeating or counterproductive, as I mentioned, because several of these projects, and this has been well documented, where the very species that the lawsuit was ostensibly designed to protect ultimately suffer when the whole forest burns. And so, yeah, I do think there are research questions. I do think, though, too, that it's worth pointing out, though, that there can be legitimate objections to how a project is proposed, and there has been a lot of collaborative work among different conservation organizations and communities like Bozeman, other cities, other stakeholders in this process, in forest restoration projects that come to the table, hash out some of the disagreements, and come to kind of compromise solutions. Often the litigant groups are not involved in that process, right? So sometimes it's disruptive to these collaborations that I think are ultimately good faith collaborations to try to wrestle with some of the challenges where maybe there are impacts to recreational values or environmental values that need to be modified in some cases to address those issues. But the litigation is often coming from a different group.
Great. So maybe following up on that a little bit, thinking about possible research directions and some research I know PERC has done in the past. Can you tell us at all, so your talk was really focused on kind of what's going on federal land, rightfully so, because it looms large in this picture, but how can we contrast that to how forests are typically managed on state land, tribal land, private land? What lessons can we learn from looking off of federal land?
Yeah, that's a great question. And PERC has done a lot of work at comparing these different institutional structures across, whether it's forests or other aspects of land use, to try to understand to what extent do these different institutional arrangements matter. And certainly that's the case with forests. So a study that PERC did about a decade or so ago focused on forest management at the federal level compared to tribal level. So there was a forest in Montana that was controlled by a Native American tribe, and right beside it was the national forest. And on a bunch of different metrics, the tribal forest vastly succeeded the performance of the federal forest. And some of that has to do with some of the sort of policy barriers that I mentioned that the federal government has to deal with just to do some of this work to manage their forests. And so certainly that's the case for that kind of example with tribes. States are another example where there's a lot of evidence that states do a better job at managing their lands. States often have a very different mandate when it comes to their land management. It's often they're looking for ways to generate revenue from those lands, and so they are more actively managed than the federal forests. And then private timber owners obviously have a major interest in preserving the long-term economic viability of their landscapes, and so they do a lot to manage their forests to reduce extreme fire risks.
Great. Maybe I'll sneak in one more question. So I think I saw on Twitter the other day, a new article being touted talking about changes in the causes of wildfire over time. And the upshot was that it seems like we have a lot more sort of human-caused fires. And so, maybe to think about some of PERC's work on recreational management, how should we think about that side of forest management and of fire management, of sort of who starts the fires and what can we do about sort of managing recreation better?
Yeah, I saw that report as well. Certainly the story of the West now is increased development in the wildland-urban interface, right? So more people are moving to these places that are also places with high fire risks. And so with that comes, more people just on the landscape doing things that can cause fires to happen. And so we are seeing certainly an uptick in human-caused fires. I think the point that comes to mind to me when I read about that kind of stuff is, what we ultimately need to focus on is making our forest more resilient to fire, right? And whether that fire comes from lightning strikes or it comes from humans, we have to be in a position where fire is going to happen, and the question is, are we set up to be able to withstand that? In the case of the Bozeman project that I mentioned, whether a fire, and you're familiar with this area too, whether a fire in Highlight is caused by a lightning strike or is caused by a recreationist or a campfire that spreads, doesn't really change the way the Forest Service needs to think about what it needs to do, right? It still needs to do forest restoration to protect the watershed and to protect those recreational values. And so it maybe, if anything, it just underscores the importance of this kind of work. And, because people aren't going to move out of the wild and urban interface anytime soon, so we got to be able to manage our forests to address those risks.
For sure. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah.
We're going to open up to questions from the audience. And of course, the person sitting in the middle of the audience has just raised his hand asking for the microphone. Of course. Professor Shelley.
Early in your presentation, you suggested there was, I guess, a kind of 19th century view of the wilderness that was, we might describe as almost romantic or aesthetic, perhaps. And then you suggested that this was important because it carried over into kind of federal government's policies perspective, or its sort of point of departure for looking at these at the landscapes and the like. I'm wondering if you could provide some account of the causes for this connection. I mean, what are sort of the reasons that this aesthetic or romantic perspective really held sway or was a dominant view? Because it strikes me that the pioneers, the homesteaders, I mean, those who weren't just visiting and imagining it as this romantic wilderness, who were actually working it rather industriously and otherwise, had a very different view. Why is it that their view didn't translate into policy at the higher levels?
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's what's so fascinating about repeat photography at showcasing those dramatic changes. And if you think about just, in the span of a human lifespan too, like you're not necessarily seeing these forests change like you can when you compare the photos from 100 years ago or so. I think PERC's done some work on sort of this notion of the Anthropocene, is this era of like recognizing that humans are a part of nature and we have these just dramatic impacts on the environment, and that nature is always is this dynamic thing that's always changing, but in the moment it's hard to recognize that. So these early visitors to the West, right, they had this romantic view of like what they were seeing in these landscapes as this product of nature, right, and not fully understanding the ways in which it was shaped by humans, and by when we certainly like the removal of Native Americans from Yosemite Valley and the ways in which they were actively managing forests. And once you remove that from the ecosystem, it takes time to understand the effects of that, and the ways in which the forests have regrown over the last century are kind of showcased in those photographs. So Yeah, I don't know how to answer your specific question, but I just think it reminds me of just how it takes a lot of time to understand those changes, and there's been, I think, now this recognition of just how much has changed since then, because we can see it through these photographs and these and comparing them to today, from then to today.
We have a question from the back, so I'm making my way around.
So I think you make a very compelling argument for why bureaucratic red tape stands in the way of timely and proactive environmental management. However, when making such an argument to the public and legislatures, many may be hesitant due to the history of the Forest Service and the NEPA lawsuits. The Forest Service actions during the implementation of the L20U regulations and the multiple RARE programs following the Wilderness Act over the 20th century demonstrate several instances of the Forest Service using an absence of legal oversight to overexploit protected public land. How would you advise the Forest Service communicate its capacity for institutional reform to the wider American public?
I mean, I think what's happening right now within the Forest Service with this, I mentioned the wildfire strategy, so this paradigm shift within the agency of really wrestling with this issue of have these management approaches of the last century created a situation where we need a new approach, and the Forest Service seems to be really all in on that in terms of a new approach, and that's, again, like I stress, it's not a kind of it's not shifting. It's a bipartisan thing. It's not like kind of from administration to administration. There's a focus on this kind of consistently over the last 2 different administrations on recognizing the need for this type of work. So I think it's just a fundamental change within the agency in terms of understanding what they need to do. I think the last several years of the last decade really of extreme fires in the West, as bad as they've been, if anything, have just helped, I think, get us to this point where there's broader recognition of the need to change course a little bit and to embrace, some of these new ideas. And so yeah, I think that's already happening within the agency, and I think you're seeing now more interest in Congress on both sides of the aisles. You're seeing these really interesting collaborations between people that otherwise are not partnering together on policy initiatives to try to get at some of these permitting barriers and to streamline the process of getting this work done on the ground.
Are there other questioners? Yeah, good. Thank you.
I have a house up in Pine, Arizona, 100 miles out, right outside of Payson, so I'm very interested in this subject. When you get a wild burning fire 4 miles from your front door, it makes you think real hard. But we have some of the projects you addressed in your presentation. You're working with the Nature Conservancy and commercial product and elsewise. How close does the processing plants to work, mills or elsewise, have to be to reduce transportation costs and elsewise? Is it 100 miles? Can you transport 200 miles out? Right. Address that one. The second one is in Pine, what we know historically is that it was forested wrongly as well. One, there was undergrowth, but then the Farm Bureau, the ranchers and else, wise other population, put too many cattle on the property. And then there's wild horses. Then we're importing elk. How do we do then that kind of work besides dealing with every intergovernmental agency, all those other constituents in the lobbying process?
Yeah, I'll try to address your last question, because that's the big. I mean, the Forest Service is the land of many uses, right? It's multiple uses, and that's kind of the fundamental challenge that the agency faces, is juggling all these different competing demands, and that's part of why you end up with this analysis paralysis, right? Because sort of everyone has a say, and there's so many different competing and often conflicting mandates and regulations for the agency to deal with itself, which just raises costs and creates delay, and so that's just a major challenge. To your first question about how close do the mills need to be, I don't know the exact answer. I mean, I think it obviously depends on fuel costs are a major thing. I know this region is one that has been heavily impacted by closures of mills over the last several decades. There are other parts of the country where the Northwest, where there's still significant mill capacity, but a lot of it's not necessarily tailored for the type of material that we're talking about here for some of these projects, and so those are some of the challenges. So I don't know the exact. I don't have a number for the exact kind of mileage that it takes, but it does need to be fairly close. You mentioned the Nature Conservancy. There is I don't know. I can't remember if it's Oregon or Washington, but there's an example where the Nature Conservancy has been working with the Forest Service to try to get more forest restoration done, and the Nature Conservancy, I believe, has been trying to even make some initial investments in supporting like mill infrastructure to be able to process the material. But the hesitancy has been, well, we don't know if the Forest Service is going to be able to really credibly commit to being able to provide a supply over some amount of time that will make this investment worthwhile. And so just to underscore again that challenge of being able to assure adequate supply to justify those investments. But thank you for that question.
You have a question here. You, Michael.
Yeah, I am originally from Idaho, and when I was in college, the logging industry took a real beating, and there's a lot of logging. There's a lot of grumpiness toward the federal government as well. But with the cleaning out of the forest, there is a potential supply, continuous supply, whether it's small diameter, brush. I'm wondering if, it looks like your audience is policymakers, but how do you encourage that is it through policy? Is it, if you want to get the mills back up and running and creating jobs in places that historically have done a lot of logging and using those logging products, how do you get them encouraged to back again to put the investments into their facilities and start being able to produce toilet paper, whatever those products may be?
Yeah, that's a great question. Idaho, I mentioned Good Neighbor Authority, and so that's a tool that Idaho is like the leader in terms of being able to, the state of Idaho to work with the Forest Service, and the state of Idaho will be the leader on developing and implementing the project on national forest lands, and will take a large portion of the timber receipts that come from that. And so, that's one of the tools that's out there that Idaho's certainly taken advantage of. And I think, again, I mentioned at the very end the idea of a restoration fund. And so, the vision here, and we've been working a little bit with policymakers on this idea, is to have a fund. So the Forest Service has said we want to raise $50 million to support these projects. We'll see if they can do that, if Congress will devote that money. But the better way that Congress, if they are going to spend that money, would be to actually create a fund that the Forest Service can use separate from the appropriations process, the political kind of driven appropriation process, but that is limited to just restoration projects and can be spent beyond these sort of annual appropriation limits. Because again, I think it comes down to being able to commit to a long-term supply for this material, because you're not going to have these mills come online or come back, that have been shuttered right over the last couple of decades, if they don't know if they're going to have supply there. And so I think that's really important. We've done similar work with the National Park Service as it relates to deferred maintenance. I won't go into that too detailed, other than to say the idea has been, and this is something Congress actually did recently, was to create a dedicated fund for deferred maintenance issues in the National Park Service, and take that away from the kind of congressional appropriations process and keep it within the agency that is can be spent over time and not sort of limited to the annual appropriation process. So that's a very kind of in the weeds wonky issue, but it's really important to your exact question, which is how do we get these mills back, and how do we get them tailored in a way that maybe the future of this is more of the small diameter trees, and figuring out ways to make that profitable. Exactly. Yeah.
Michael.
So you mentioned that the Forest Service has a 10-year goal to do 20 million acres of restoration projects, and they have an 80 million need.
Backlog, yeah.
So I'm just wondering, sort of, how good are they at targeting strategically, if you're going to do 20 million acres over the next 10 years, so 2 million a year on average, how effective is that 2 million? Can they identify the prospective hotspots or the way to target that money? How soon can we sort of expect to see wildfires in the West trending now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the Forest Service has released an initial set of kind of high priority fire sheds and watersheds that they want to make the initial investments in. And some of that work is already ongoing. And it's geographically spread throughout the West in areas that, are in areas that would have large impacts to nearby communities, whether it's, water quality or other things. But to your point, I mean, so the issue there though is like how quickly can we get this work done? So those projects are limited so far to kind of shovel-ready projects that are already through the NEPA process more or less, and just kind of need this funding, right, to get them off the ground. That's one thing, right? But the larger challenge is, what about the projects that aren't shovel-ready, that aren't through the NEPA process, and maybe haven't even started that process? And to the graph that I showed, you're talking potentially 7, 8, 9 years that it can take to get through that process. And so that's been some of the points of some of the work we've done lately, is that you can dedicate as much money, Congress can dedicate as much money as it wants to this issue, but if you ultimately don't address the red tape barriers that prevent this work from getting done in a timely manner, we might get to the end of the 10-year strategy and maybe not made very much progress, because we will have already gotten through all the shovel-ready projects and we'll still be in the environmental review process for the other projects that we really need to do. So this is the challenge that, I mean, as you know, in the energy context, is like the permitting issue, and how do we get, we can throw a lot of money at stuff, but if we can't address permitting, how effective are we ultimately going to be? That's a really similar challenge in the forest restoration context, to getting these projects done in a timely manner.
I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I'd like to let you know that our next event, which will be the last for this semester, is upcoming in 5 weeks or so, on April 11th. Same space, same time, 5 to 6:30, here in the Memorial Union in this room. And we'll be having a major natural resource economist come, Gary Leibkap, and from Santa Barbara, right? He was UC Santa Barbara. He's just recently retired from UC Santa Barbara. And he's going to be talking about how markets might help to solve Colorado River water shortages. And that's a key issue for people in the area. And we're happy to have one of the world's experts be with us for a time. And let's thank Sean for coming, and for Brian for help facilitating.